When I married Thomas, I thought the hardest part would be the usual things: learning to share a closet, arguing about which way the toilet paper should hang, blending routines. But none of that compared to her. From day one, Margaret made it painfully clear I wasn't the wife she'd pictured for her precious son. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her disapproval came in polished phrases and polite poison, always with an audience nearby. She had a talent for the kind of compliments that sting long after the words fade. "That's an interesting dress, Isabella. Very brave of you." Or my personal favorite: "Thomas always liked women with strong opinions. It must be exciting for him." I used to laugh it off, play nice, keep the peace. I told myself she'd come around eventually, that maybe she just needed time to see who I really was. But years passed. Holidays came and went, and if anything, she only sharpened her claws. Every dinner, every birthday, every gathering, she turned them into tests I was never meant to pass. I could feel her watching me, waiting for a misstep, measuring me against ghosts I never even met. And Thomas? He'd just sigh and say, "That's just how she is, babe. She'll warm up to you." I started to wonder if he really believed that, or if he just didn't want to see what I saw. The truth is, I tried. I really did. I smiled through the slights, bit my tongue when she corrected me in front of guests, and helped clean up after dinners she never thanked me for. I learned the choreography of keeping the peace: pour the wine, nod politely, dodge the landmines. All for Thomas. I loved him enough to endure it. Or maybe I was just too proud to admit that it hurt more than I let on. There was one night, our second anniversary, when I wore a soft blue dress Thomas had picked out himself. As I walked into the room, Margaret's eyes flicked over me like I was a dust smudge on a glass. She said, "Well, that's different. I suppose not everyone can pull off pastels." Then she laughed. Everyone laughed. And I stood there trying not to shrink, reminding myself that grace doesn't mean silence, just restraint. I began to see how Margaret treated her approval like currency, one I wasn't allowed to earn. She praised Thomas's exes like they were national treasures. "Clara always brought wine from Italy, not the supermarket," she'd say, as if that was the golden standard of womanhood. At first, I wondered if I should be more like them. Now I know, no woman would have ever been good enough for her son. Not unless she could be molded, controlled, owned. Sometimes I'd watch Thomas from across the room, the way he smiled at his mother, completely unaware of the slow erosion happening just behind his back. He never noticed how tightly I held the edge of the table when Margaret spoke, or how my laughter at her comments came a second too late. He didn't see the way I flinched when she brought up Clara again, with that wistful tone that made it clear she still wished things had gone differently. I began to build little rituals to protect myself. Pep talks in the bathroom mirror before family gatherings. One deep breath before answering the door. Lipstick? Always. A small shield of color, like war paint. I thought if I just kept showing up with kindness, if I kept being steady, she'd eventually see I wasn't the enemy. But Margaret didn't want peace. She wanted dominance, and I was beginning to run out of grace. Then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, something shifted. Not with a fight, not with tears. Just a simple moment, born out of a favor. I offered to help her with her laptop, something basic, routine. But while I waited for the files to load, a folder caught my eye. It wasn't labeled anything suspicious, but inside it, that was the day everything began to change. Funny how some betrayals don't come with fireworks or raised voices, just a soft click of a mouse and a quiet gasp you have to swallow. That day, sitting at her dining room table, Margaret asked me to help with something simple: update her email password. She was unusually pleasant, almost chatty. I thought maybe, just maybe, we were turning a corner. But as her laptop screen blinked open, a window she hadn't closed caught my attention. It wasn't the name of the folder that stood out, something generic, like family docs. But the contents? Entirely different story. Scans of property titles, spreadsheets of undeclared assets, and what looked like forged signatures on financial documents tied to an ongoing inheritance case. My heartbeat didn't just quicken, it thundered. This wasn't awkward paperwork. This was illegal. I remember how my hands hovered for a second, unsure. Part of me wanted to close it immediately, pretend I hadn't seen. But another part, the part that had smiled through years of insults, leaned in. I looked at Margaret then, still fussing with her tea, oblivious to what she'd just handed me. And in that moment, something ancient stirred in me. Not vengeance, not yet, just recognition. I wasn't powerless, not anymore. I closed the folder like I hadn't seen a thing, smiled sweetly, asked her to retype the password one more time, just to buy a few seconds to breathe. The whole room suddenly felt colder, like the air had thinned, but I kept my voice light, unbothered, the way she liked it. Inside, though, I was already rearranging the chessboard. She had no idea she'd handed me a match, and I was holding the flame. That night, after dinner, I copied the folder quietly while Thomas was upstairs brushing his teeth. Just a quick transfer to a USB I kept in my drawer for work. And while the files loaded, I stared at the screen like I was looking at her reflection. Not the woman she pretended to be, but the one I always knew was there. The manipulator. The deceiver. The woman who'd spent years trying to make me feel small, now crumbling behind digital paperwork. I could have screamed. Could have confronted her right away. But instead, I sat back and smiled. Not out of victory. Not yet. It was something deeper. The stillness that comes when the scales finally balance. I looked at that little USB like it was a key. Not just to her secrets, but to a whole new power. For the first time in a long time, I felt calm. Like I wasn't just surviving in her world anymore. I was quietly rewriting the rules. The next morning, I watched her pour coffee like nothing had happened. She wore her usual pearls, that stiff cardigan she always buttoned to the top, as if control could be stitched into fabric. She made small talk about local news, complained about someone's landscaping. Same performance, same stage. But I wasn't her audience anymore. I sipped slowly and smiled back, knowing something she didn't. At one point, she glanced up and asked, "Everything okay, dear?" And I nodded, almost too casually. "Lovely, thank you. You're such a gracious host." That little line landed soft, but with just enough weight to make her pause for half a second. That was new. I used to answer her questions like I was on trial. Now, I let her feel the silence that followed, let her wonder what had shifted. And as I put my cup down, I looked around that pristine kitchen. The framed photos, the polished silver, the illusion of order. And thought, so the queen has a secret. Not the kind you cry over, the kind you pay to bury. I stood, straightened my coat, and said goodbye with a smile that probably looked too kind. But behind it, something had begun to bloom, quiet, steady, and no longer afraid. I spent the next few nights with her secrets spread across my screen like puzzle pieces. No wine, no music, just the quiet click of my mouse and the hum of a truth too big to ignore. The deeper I looked, the uglier it got. Shady property transfers, shell accounts, entire assets tucked away in names I didn't recognize. It wasn't just carelessness. It was deliberate, methodical. She'd built an empire of lies, brick by careful brick. I made copies, labeled everything, organized the documents like I was curating an exhibit no one would ever want to see. Then I reached out to someone I trusted, an old college friend who'd gone into law. Discreet, sharp, no nonsense. I sent over what I had, held my breath, and waited. Her response came quickly. Isabella, if this went public, your mother-in-law would be done. Fines, asset seizure, maybe worse. And just like that, I wasn't holding a match anymore. I was holding fire. Still, I didn't rush. I watched Margaret from across dinner tables and Sunday visits, her voice as sharp as ever, her jabs still dressed as jokes. But something had shifted inside me. Her power didn't land anymore. She could talk all she wanted. I had her truth in my pocket. And one evening, while Thomas was out with friends, I decided it was time for a private conversation. She opened the door wearing her usual smile, tight, rehearsed, a little too curious. Is everything all right? She asked, stepping aside. I didn't answer right away. I just walked in, calm and steady, like I was there to borrow sugar. She offered me tea. I declined, sat down, looked her right in the eye. I wanted her to feel it before I even spoke. That quiet tremor in the air when something is about to change. I know why you've always hated me, I said. No drama, just truth. Her expression didn't falter, not at first. But I saw it. The blink, the breath held for a second too long. I pulled the USB from my coat pocket and slid it across the table. Her hand twitched. This contains everything I found on your laptop, I continued, my voice steady. And before you ask, yes, I've made copies. Safe ones. She tried to speak, but I raised my hand gently, like a teacher silencing a child. You've spent years trying to make me feel like an outsider. Like I wasn't worthy of the seat I already had. But let me be very clear. If you ever speak to me with disrespect again, if you ever try to undermine me, I won't hesitate. I leaned back, letting the weight of it settle. You wanted a war. I just brought the terms. For a moment, she just stared at the USB like it might explode. Her hands, always so composed, so calculated, were suddenly restless. She reached for her pearls, adjusted them, then folded her fingers in her lap as if rehearsing control. But it was too late for performance. I'd pulled back the curtain, and the woman behind it wasn't nearly as terrifying as she believed herself to be. Still, I wasn't there to destroy her. Not unless she made me. I was offering something else entirely. A boundary. One lined with teeth. I told her, you don't have to like me. You never did. But you will respect me. And if you can't manage that, then I promise, your world will collapse before you ever see it coming. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence did more damage than any scream could. As I stood to leave, I looked down at her. Smaller now somehow. Or maybe I'd just finally stopped shrinking myself to fit her comfort. Good night, Margaret, I said softly, as if we'd just shared dessert and polite conversation. And as I closed her front door behind me, I felt lighter. Not vindicated yet. No, that would come later. But for the first time in years, I wasn't the one afraid to speak. It didn't happen all at once. Margaret didn't suddenly hug me or apologize or send flowers the next morning. No, the shift was more subtle and far more satisfying. It was in what she didn't say. No more comments about my cooking. No more passive-aggressive digs about my clothes or how I stacked the dishwasher. For the first time in our history, her silence was respectful, maybe even fearful. The next family dinner was the true test. She arrived early, as always, but instead of inspecting the silverware or pointing out a stain on the napkins, she offered to help, just like that. Do you need anything, Isabella? I nearly dropped the serving spoon. I played it cool, nodded once, and handed her the salad tongs. Inside, though, I was savoring every second of it like it was dessert. She didn't dominate the conversation that night. She didn't drop Clara's name once. And when someone complimented the roast chicken, Margaret actually smiled and said, Isabella's really grown into her own, hasn't she? The table went quiet for a second. Even Thomas looked up, confused. I just smiled and took a sip of wine, letting him sit with the mystery, because I wasn't about to spell it out for him. Not yet. Thomas asked me later that night while brushing his teeth, "What's going on with my mom? She's been different." I shrugged, drying my face with a towel, hiding the tiniest smirk. "Maybe she's finally seeing me," I said. I didn't lie, but I didn't explain either, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone else connect the dots, slowly, painfully, on their own. The truth is, Margaret hadn't changed overnight. She'd simply recognized something she never expected to find in me: power. Not loud, not flashy, but unshakable. The kind that settles in your posture, your voice, the way you enter a room and don't ask for space. You take it. She must have realized the rules had shifted. That the daughter-in-law she tried to shrink now held the upper hand. And, oh, how carefully she walked around me now. Invitations to dinner. Thoughtful texts with recipes she thought I might like. She even started calling before visiting, unheard of. It was strange at first, like watching a snake try to dance. But I let her try. Let her attempt her version of grace. Because I knew it wasn't affection that had changed her. It was consequence. And sometimes, that's enough. One Sunday afternoon, during a casual lunch with extended family, someone made a light joke. Something about how Margaret and I finally seemed to be getting along. "Took you too long enough," they laughed, reaching for the breadbasket. I looked at Margaret, who froze just slightly, her smile flickering before snapping back into place. I could have laughed. Instead, I gave them all the simplest truth. "Sometimes respect doesn't come with time," I said, gently folding my napkin. "Sometimes it comes with consequences." No one knew exactly what I meant, not even Thomas, who glanced at me with that curious tilt of his head. But Margaret? She understood. Her grip on her wineglass tightened just a bit, and for once she didn't have a clever retort. Only silence. After that, things just settled. The air between us wasn't warm, but it was no longer sharp. She still wore her pearls, still told her stories, but the edges were softer now. Or maybe I'd just stopped letting them cut. And as we cleared the dishes and exchanged polite goodbyes, I could feel something shift beneath it all. Not forgiveness, not friendship. Just a new balance, one that would hold. I don't walk on eggshells anymore. I walk like I belong, like I always did, even when she tried to make me doubt it. Margaret still hosts her garden teas and shares family gossip with that tight little smile. But there's a difference now. She watches what she says. She thinks before she acts. And me? I don't flinch anymore. I don't shrink to fit her comfort. I take up space, unapologetically. At the next family gathering, I wore red. Bold, unmistakable, the kind of color Margaret always called a little too much for daytime. I laughed too loudly. I touched Thomas's shoulder when I spoke. I moved through the room like it was mine, because it was. I had earned every inch of that table, every seat, every glance. Margaret didn't dare challenge me. She just complimented the appetizers and asked if I needed help. At one point, a cousin, tipsy from too much Prosecco, leaned over and said, "You two finally get along. What changed?" I looked over at Margaret, who was watching me from the other end of the table, trying to read my expression. I smiled, calm and deliberate, and said, "Respect is a choice." And I gave her one. There was a silence after that, the kind that says more than any toast ever could. Later that evening, I stood alone in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the last slivers of sunset stretch across the backyard. The house was quiet now, just the soft hum of the dishwasher, distant laughter from the living room. I could hear Margaret's voice, still chatting, still present. But it no longer had the weight it once did. She wasn't the center anymore. And that was the true shift. It wasn't revenge that filled me. It was clarity. I'd spent years waiting for her to soften, to welcome me, to accept me. But I didn't need her approval. I never did. What I needed was to remember what I was capable of. Not cruelty, not manipulation, control. I had found a way to hold her accountable without becoming her. And that kind of power? It doesn't roar. It whispers. And it's heard louder because of it. Before I went upstairs, I opened my desk drawer. The USB was still there, a small silver reminder of everything I could do and everything I didn't need to anymore. I held it for a moment, weighing not just the drive, but the choice. Then I walked over to the trash bin and dropped it in. Not out of forgiveness, but because I knew she'd never make that mistake again. She'd felt what silence could do. I watched as the bin closed, slow and quiet. No fireworks, no triumphant music, just the soft click of a chapter ending. Not because I'd erased the past, but because I no longer needed to hold it in my hand to remember what I'd learned. Power isn't always about exposure. Sometimes it's about knowing you could burn everything down and choosing to let it stand. Later that night, Thomas wrapped his arms around me as we got ready for bed, his voice warm and tired. "You were amazing today," he whispered. I kissed his cheek and smiled, knowing he'd never truly understand what today had cost me, or what it had proven. But that was all right. Not every crown is worn on the head. Some are carried deep, forged in silence and fire. And as I turned off the light, I thought of Margaret, of her pearls, her pride, her perfectly rehearsed performance. She taught me how cruel power can be, how sharp and dismissive. But I taught her something far quieter. I taught her how devastating silence can become. And in the end, that was the lesson she would never forget, because I never let her hear me coming.